Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Korea after 25 years, and a great honor to be speaking to this very distinguished audience, including the Commissioner and former Commissioner of the Intellectual Property Office and the former President of the Korean Academy of Engineering. I first want to thank the organizers for inviting us, in particular Dr. Kim and his Intellectual Property Committee. But I also want to thank my colleagues from the United States. You're very fortunate not to be listening to me, but to be able to hear from two of the leading practitioners of intellectual property acquisition and licensing. One, Catherine Koo on the university side, one, Marshall Phelps on the industrial side. And in addition, to be able to hear from the two leading economists of a quite large group of economists who have been examining how the U.S. system works for a number of years, and on whose work we drew heavily in developing our recent report. The subject of my introductory comments is that report. It is to introduce you to some issues in the management of intellectual property, relationships between universities and private industry in the United States, which will introduce you to a number of themes that other speakers will address in more detail. But first I want to enter a disclaimer, which is that I'm not at all sure what the United States experience, what the relevance of the United States experience is to Korea or other countries. Superficially, from our perspective, it appears that a number of other countries are moving in what we might call the United States direction, giving more authority and responsibility to universities, less to faculty, less to governments. But we are aware that there are a very large number of differences between the U.S. higher education system and those of other countries. That in particular, we moved from a system of government ownership to one of university ownership of intellectual property, whereas most other countries are moving from a system of professor privilege to one of university management. We're aware that we have peculiar traditions of academic freedom, reward on the basis of scholarly merit. We're aware that the public and private system of higher education in the United States differs from other countries in that the public component is one associated with the states rather than the federal government. So I will try in my remarks to talk about what I think might be relevant U.S. experience, but I hope in discussion you'll correct me and say, no, that's not relevant to Korea for such and such reasons. I should begin by introducing you very quickly to how the United States academies do policy studies of this sort. They originate from a variety of sources, including direct requests of the government, congressional mandates and legislation. Some are initiated by the Academy leadership, and we have over 100 standing committees that are disciplinary-based or cross-disciplinary. Mine, the Program on Science, Technology, and Economic Policy, is one of those, and some of those standing committees initiate their own work. We uniformly, however, conduct studies by a process of appointing a committee of experts that is carefully screened for different points of view, for different sources of expertise and experience. They deliberate in public, in a fact-finding mode, and then in private to develop their conclusions and recommendations. Their report is subject to a fairly vigorous peer review process, and it is released to the public simultaneous with its delivery to sponsors of the project. This study was, first of all, self-initiated by my board and a committee of the academies on science, technology, and law. It was privately funded, so no one requested this work, but we felt it was important for a number of reasons. First, the United States had, since the adoption of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, had accumulated 30 years of experience. And there had been a great deal of discussion and, as I alluded to before, a great deal of research about how the system is working. But we felt that no one had brought all of that discussion, research, and experience together. Secondly, it was obvious to us that universities were handling their relationships with industry and their licensing policies very differently. They were very, very heterogeneous in size, in competence, in and modes of operation, and that we might be able to discern some principles of good practice that had not yet been articulated, or had not at least been articulated by a institution with the influence of the national academies. Third, there had been and continues to be, an undercurrent of criticism of universities on the one hand, and in universities of industry behavior on the other hand. And a certain amount of distrust has accumulated over a period of time. Perhaps we could influence that in a constructive direction. Fourth, there was uncertainty about how to measure performance. And we just heard some comments about metrics, including revenues and numbers of licenses, numbers of transactions, numbers of patents, and so forth. Growing concern that those were not the best measures of performance. And finally, there have been proposals very recently to shift to a more inventor-focused system, or inventor-initiated process of technology transfer. Not inventor ownership, but giving faculty in particular a much greater leeway to market their inventions and conclude how they should be licensed. The committee in this case was chaired by a university president, the chancellor of Washington University in St. Louis, a chemical engineer, and included members from, as we commonly do, from academia, both on the research side and the administrative side, IP practice and IP scholarship, experience in both the information technology and biopharma industries, from finance, from economics and public policy, and for not-for-profit organizations. It's a very diverse committee. I'm pleased that three of the members of that committee are here: Marshall Phelps, Jerry Thursby, and Catherine Koo. And it followed the principal methods of developing their conclusions and recommendations that I mentioned earlier. The report has four principal findings, mainly factual findings, 5 general objectives or principles, and 14 recommendations for improvements in the U.S. system. So although there is widespread feeling that the system is relatively effective, where our conclusion was that it could be improved in a number of ways. The first finding was that, and this is a perspective that I think should be shared around the world, is that intellectual property based transactions are a very small part of a process of transferring academic discovery and knowledge to the industrial community where it can be used, or to the not-for-profit or other parts of the private sector where it can be used. And that these include, most importantly, employment of students trained at universities, but also publications, conferences, collaborations, consulting, liaison programs, and so forth. Very difficult to quantify the relative importance of these avenues of technology transfer, but the report's judgment is that all of these modes are more important than IP-based transactions. And that is supported by surveys of industry. Secondly, we looked at a lot of research growing out of concern that the process of commercializing university inventions was undermining traditional values of the academic community. That, for example, it was encouraging greater secrecy, delays in publication. Secondly, that it might be shifting the balance of research from more basic research to more applied research. In the United States, universities are highly prized for their unique contribution to the support of basic research, and there's a great deal of concern that they not be reoriented toward more applied and more commercial research. And finally, that processes of hiring and promotion might be undermined if commercial criteria for success in invention, in patenting, in licensing, overrode scholarly merit in hiring and promotion decisions. Actually, a fair amount of research has been done on those points, and it suggests that this is not a major problem. Third, for the area of patentable inventions and discoveries out of universities, the regime that the United States adopted in 1980, known as the Bayh-Dole Act, is superior to its predecessor, government ownership, in encouraging commercialization of inventions. There's a good deal of debate about the relative responsibility of the Bayh-Dole Act relative to other developments at the same time, but at least it's clear that it is superior to its predecessor. And finally, the committee concluded that there's not really a basis for shifting markedly to a system in which university faculty in particular, but also other university inventors, have a much greater leeway to market and license their inventions. Not only because there's not a lot of evidence that a great many would take advantage of that leeway, preferring to conduct their research and teaching, but also that it would create conditions leading to more conflicts of interest, which universities would find hard to manage, and less accountability to the public paying for the research. So what about the principle of recommendations and objectives going forward? Well, one we think is probably relevant to other countries, and that is that it's important to clarify what the objectives are. And there are many legitimate objectives. One is simply making university research available and used to the benefit of the public. That's certainly a primary objective. But others, including local economic development, support of faculty, and others are legitimate. There is one on which the report, however, raised a great deal of caution, and that is, as we heard in the remarks a few minutes ago, the question of how much money is earned by universities in licensing their inventions. And this, we feel, is should not be an overriding objective, even though it may be in a number of institutions, for two reasons. One is that success is very limited. The case you heard earlier of Northwestern University earning $700-odd million in 1 year is an extraordinary exception. Very few universities earn significant amounts of revenue from licensing, and those that do earn them from a very, very few inventions. So that it is, in effect, a lottery, not one that should guide not a motivation that should guide university conduct. The other reason is that making revenue a principal objective or a principal metric of performance creates incentives that are somewhat at odds with the more general purpose of transferring technology. It makes licensing officers of universities more insistent on terms that may be unrealistic with respect to the stage of development of a particular technology, for example. In line with that recommendation is the idea that a technology transfer or technology licensing function is, in general, better situated along with other research management functions, for example, along with the function of negotiating research agreements with industry, than it is if it is situated in, for example, the university business office. The committee concluded that there's a tendency for technology transfer operations in universities to be somewhat insulated from both outside influence and internal guidance. And here we had recommendations that differed according to the size of not the size of the university necessarily, but the size and diversity of a university's research portfolio. We suggested that for very large institutions with the resources to mount a significant technology licensing effort, their outside influences could be encouraged by creating an advisory committee. But in the case of smaller institutions, which might be more relevant experience for other countries, or institutions with smaller research portfolios, we suggested that they consider several different options. One, permitting faculty a greater degree of autonomy and outreach, collaborating with institutions, particularly in areas in which they have collaborative research projects, and third, outsourcing, something that American universities have been very reluctant to do. And that outsourcing might be to private entities that specialize in a particular field, even are regionally focused, or both. We suggested that universities review their operations in the same manner that they review their academic departments by inviting a visiting committee of experts from other institutions, from business, to come and conduct an oversight of the operation of the technology licensing function and make recommendations to the university administration. A third major objective was to be more supportive of entrepreneurship. In this connection, we observed that there are inevitably a number of disputes that arise between faculty members, between faculty and technology licensing administrators. They may be disputes that involve students or research staff, non-tenured research staff, and that there ought to be a transparent mechanism for resolving these disputes with an internal university community. There is a growing popularity, emphasis in the United States on creating new startup companies out of university research rather than licensing to existing firms. This has obvious appeal to institutions that are concerned about their local political support, because those firms tend to locate near the university. And there's also a belief in the United States that small firms, and new firms in particular, are much more likely to create new jobs. But there is also a growing support within the university faculty for allowing those faculty that invent significant discoveries to participate in the development of a new firm. This is a good thing on the whole, but it is not always practicable. And the technology may not lend itself to a startup, much more appropriate to license to established firms. This is a judgment that the university needs to make, and it needs to be made on the basis that the elements of a startup that make for a greater probability of its success, including that it has a clear conception of the market need, a vetted business plan, investment capital, and management, which is not likely, the top management is not likely to be members of the faculty. It needs to make a judgment about whether those requisites are in place before agreeing that a startup is the right course of action. When it does, it should not engage in extensive, onerous negotiations with the faculty, but should recognize that startups have a high failure rate. They're fragile, vulnerable. They are unlikely to make significant profits over a long term, and that the licensing terms ought to be fairly routine and streamlined. Another set of recommendations dealt with relationships of the university to other institutions. And here, one of the particular problems in the United States, which may not exist elsewhere, is that there has grown up a tendency to associate the transfer of biological materials used solely in basic research to entail them with conditions that anticipate that they might lead to a discovery that has commercial potential. And this has delayed the transfer and prevented the transfer of some essential materials for research. We recommended that process be streamlined as well. There have grown up a number of principles of good licensing practice. They arose out of another effort that Catherine Koo was a party of, and she can discuss in more detail. They led to a series of recommendations called the 9 Points for licensing, which our report strongly endorsed. We also suggested that universities not be quick to litigate their patents, to sue for patent infringement, except in unusual circumstances. And we suggested that when the sponsor of a research is a private entity, an industrial concern, again, processes be streamlined to avoid what has become, in many cases, onerous, lengthy, and sometimes ultimately unproductive negotiations. The fifth theme of our report is accountability to the public, which is paying for the research, or the bulk of the research. And here we suggested that, that the federal role be centralized, the federal oversight role be centralized in a particular agency, that the universities provide more robust data to the federal government and ensure its integrity. And so thank you very much. Those are the recommendations of this report. And as I say, I'm sure we'll have more discussion about their relevance to your experience, but also here in more detail, explanation or discussion of these themes in the United States from our other speakers. Thank you very much.